As a quick disclaimer, this video that you're about to see is the third installment of the documentary series The War on Kids, and it's the final part of the first chapter. So I know that's kind of confusing, but it's going to be a long series, so I'm breaking it up into chapters. So anyways, if you would like to start from the beginning, then I recommend you just stop this video now and start with part one, which you can find in the video section of my channel. Anyways, moving on, the theme of chapter one has been to expose the fact that Satan, who is also the god of this world, happens to be the head of the so-called music industry as well. And by this point in the series, I hope to have convinced you that the music industry and the entertainment industry at large is practically just a domestic weapon of mass psychological warfare, to put it poetically and also to put it bluntly. And even worse, much of it is deliberately designed to corrupt man's faith in God, man's faith in the Christian God, and in the Bible specifically. And when it comes to the modern music industry, that has so many blatant examples of Satanism on display, many of which we've gone over in previous portions of this video series. But you may be wondering at this point why there doesn't seem to be a serious outcry, or backlash from the public with all this stuff. Because to a sensible person, it does seem baffling to consider that such an outright demonic source of influence could be praised and celebrated in the streets, let alone promoted to children, or even target marketed to the youth demographic specifically. Yet that's the reality of what's going on around us, and everybody knows that it's true, but there doesn't seem to be any pushback about it. And so you might be wondering, where's the public outcry? But did you know that there was a time when Christians and good parents in America actually attempted to confront and to stand up to the growing influence of Satanism in our culture? Between the 1980s and 90s, there were a few national events which drew public attention to the reality and to the prominence of satanic cults in high places. There was a really popular book at that time called Michelle Remembers, which chronicled the details of a woman's psychiatric sessions while she was undergoing a controversial practice that's known as recovered memory therapy. During these sessions, Michelle unearthed a terrifying well of memories. She suddenly recalled the gruesome details of satanic rituals that she was forced to attend throughout her childhood. Her memories included being present to human sacrifices and abortions and sexual and physical abuse against her and others, as well as the desecration of corpses, and that's just to name a few. And those are some pretty tame examples, by the way. Though the book had many critics, it was a bestseller, and it sparked an avalanche of similar allegations being made by people everywhere, all that had corroborating claims of their own experiences at the hands of these cults. The technical term for this type of crime is SRA, or satanic ritual abuse. It's a real phenomenon by which law enforcement has been well aware for a long time. But before this time, people had no idea of its prevalence, and the world was shocked by the volume of allegations being made against ritual abuse by people everywhere. What was most surprising to the general public was that a lot of these occurrences seemed to be most prominent in high-class and affluent communities. But of course, ever since Epstein didn't kill himself, this statistic makes a lot more sense to everybody. And then there was the McMartin preschool nightmare, or as it's referred to these days, the McMartin preschool trial. And this involved the staff of McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, being accused of satanic ritual abuse by 360 students. I did not misspeak there. 360 students alleged to have been abused by the staff at this school. But as if that's not sickening enough, the allegations went far beyond physical and sexual abuse. These children were literally telling identical stories about being pimped out to rich people and being made to participate in bizarre rituals. And apparently there were like tunnels underneath the school, and it was just really bizarre. And I gotta summarize this for the sake of time and for the sake of staying on topic, but you really should take the time to look deeper into this McMartin preschool trial thing. I mean, it's just nuts. But here's the thing about it. It was the longest running and most expensive trial in American history, and yet nobody knows about it. We all remember O.J. Simpson's trial, but not the McMartin preschool trial. Similarly, we also don't remember the Franklin scandal, as it's called, which was another bombshell revelation from the late 1980s. This one incriminated politicians and bankers and other elite figures, but it also had connections to Satanism, like the McMartin thing. But once again, it went under the media's radar as they focused on whatever was going on with the celebrities and with the rock stars. And sadly, things haven't changed when it comes to this tactic, I mean, even as I record this, every outlet of the mainstream media is reporting on the divorce trial of two celebrities that are getting divorced. But meanwhile, there was a total media blackout concerning the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, who was Jeffrey Epstein's pimp, but whatever, I just had to throw that in there. But anyways, as all these big cases continued unfolding throughout the late 1980s and the early 1990s, society began to revolt against Satanism and actually began to revolt against, the satanic symbolism that was popping up everywhere. And the prevalence of all these horrible events in the news that were associated with Satanism caused a rightful stir in Americans at that time. And many people were amazed to discover that many of their favorite entertainment icons were associated with the occult, and churches were encouraging their congregations to destroy their rock and roll tapes and CDs, and there was a little revival going on against Satanism and against its influence in our culture. And it would seem that people were finally kind of drawing their line in the sand. But as the church rallied against the growing influence of Satanism, in our culture, the rest of society embraced it. And while the old classic rock bands and the popular celebrities from the hippie era were all coming under fire for their occultic associations, there was a new trend emerging, one where Satanism was just explicitly celebrated, just blatantly, just in its face. Because after all, rock and roll was always about rebellion, right? It was always about, if it's too loud, then you're too old, right? It just kept getting louder and faster and faster and louder, till eventually singing just turned into screaming, and it just turned into a competition over who could be more extreme and intense. And what could be more rebellious, by the way, than to represent Lucifer himself, the original rebel. And all these admittedly and outspoken satanic bands started rolling out to mainstream audiences. In fact, Satanism became so normalized within metal that most kids associated the pentagram symbol just with metal music. And over the course of a decade or so, this blatant satanic stuff became more and more commonplace until it eventually permeated the entire music industry. And it became pop. And it got to the point that the majority of your top 40 radio hits all had some hint of occulticism or Satanism in it. So needless to say, the spontaneous popularity of this pro-satanic music, and pro-satanic trends in the youth culture was alarming. And for a time, it was fiercely opposed. But the opponents of this agenda had more than music to contend with. See, Satanism was cool now. It was pop culture. It was in the comic books, it was in the video games, movies, t-shirts, cartoons. It was everywhere. And eventually we went back to nobody really being afraid of Satanism anymore. We just went back there again because our entertainment was so saturated in it, that we were just sort of desensitized to Satanism. And once again, the notion of Satanism being a threat was relegated to the rank of conspiracy theory. It didn't take long before the public just stopped talking about all the high-profile crime cases that implicated Satanism. And soon, the media would mock and ridicule all the solid evidence of SRA that captivated the nation just a decade prior. They began to refer to the entire period of time as the, quote, satanic panic. Can you imagine that? That's what they called it. It was all just turned into a joke, the satanic panic, And that's how they regard it today. That's how the world refers to a Christian revival against evil, the satanic panic. And so once again, I'll remind you about the McMartin preschool trial. It was the longest running and most expensive trial in American history, and yet nobody's heard of it. And then when you try to research it, you can't get 2 paragraphs into the article without being thoroughly reminded that whatever you're about to read has been debunked, redacted, fact-checked, and just discredited all around. And it's the same case with nearly every event since then, which implicates Satanism and which comes under public scrutiny. Satanic panic. That's all you got to say. It's just a blanket term to immediately discredit anything that could potentially reveal the reality that these satanic cults are very real and their influence on society is huge. Look for yourself and you'll see what I mean. But anyways, the point is that after a few decades of Satanism being trivialized, in entertainment, the social majority now has an attitude of indifference towards Satanism. But the problem is that Satan is not indifferent towards us. He roams about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Of course, we didn't just fall into this hellhole overnight, you know. It was a long crawl to get to this point, but I believe that each step was strategic and deliberate as the spirit of this world carried us from a place where Elvis Presley was censored on TV because his dance moves were too provocative, you know, and into a world where the song WAP, or W-A-P by Cardi B, which is a literal article of pornography, mind you, was nominated as the Song of the Year. And it was also performed live at the Grammys in front of millions of families watching from home. You know, mothers and grandparents and children all sitting around watching this softcore porn together, you know, that's nominated as the Song of the Year. And it really is just a clown world now. But as you and I stand back in the background, just looking out at a world that is falling apart, there is a whole generation of children standing in the foreground, looking out to a world that is still full of wonder that's yet to be discovered. And that's what I'm warning you about. I'm warning you that in order to protect our children, we need to teach them to protect themselves. We need to raise them in the truth of God's word, and they must understand who the enemy is, because you can't fight a war if you don't know who the enemy is. And I hate to say it, but our children are at war, fighting for their very identity, and most of the parents are completely AWOL here within the War on Kids.
Judas Priest explode into the Capitol Center this Saturday. Judas Priest live with special guest Dokken. Tickets for Judas Priest this Saturday.
Inside of the concert.
Have fun, Judas Priest.
I want you to talk.
You've heard the band? Have you heard?
I've heard a little bit on tape, that's all.
Could you just say what you think of their music?
I like the instruments. I don't care for the beat.
You don't care for Alfonso. What about the lyrics? Have you read any of the lyrics?
I despise the lyrics.
What do you hate about them?
It's because they're all Satan worship.
It's all Satan.
If they don't like it, then fine. You know? Actually, I get off on people not liking us because, you know, I like it when people really hate us because that fits our image, and I can really be obnoxious to them and stuff, you know, just because it's...
I don't know if it's a ritual or if it's just the beat. I don't know if it's the words or if it's the beat that he likes. But
you gotta kind of go out there and just, right at first, just jump around and bang your head and thrash and do whatever you want, you know? That's the way I feel. Just do whatever you want.
What do you think about the type of music that they play? I mean, the beat and the words. What's the problem with the words?
to me, I've listened to the words, I've read the words, and all I can see, I'm a Christian, and I do not like the words. To me, they're all Satan worship, about hell, about devils, about satanic. I don't want anything to do with it.
I'm David Helby. I'm 20 years old. I'm ready to rock.
Dawn, I'm 13.
Who are you here to see tonight? Judas Priest!
Mrs. Eckert, when you were a teenager, when you were Eddie's age, what kind of music did you listen to?
Oh, let's see, rock and roll, Elvis Presley. It was before the Beatles, so that was, I don't even remember the groups.
Do you remember what people were saying about Elvis Presley?
Oh, well, before I got into the rock and roll, they didn't like him. They thought he was, you know, the way he moved around and his type of music wasn't, they wouldn't accept that. But when I got a little older, it was accepted.
Do you think this is the same thing with Eddie's music? Maybe he'll be more accepted as it goes?
Well, I don't know. I wished he would take his music and put all of his energy in some other direction. I just don't appreciate the music. It seems to me that it's all drug related. Because maybe I'm not that, I don't understand, but I can't see where any good is going to come out of it.
Metal music, it's become an anthem for certain kinds of kids. Who are they? And are they misunderstood?
If anything's on my mind, I just go and sit in my room and play some music.
There has been violence at heavy metal concerts, and stage diving looks lethal for parents who don't understand it.
People are saying that we're a negative influence.
We let the kids explain it. Storm Phillips reports the children of heavy metal.
So you guys like Priest, right? Yeah. All right. How about Dokken? How's anybody feel about
Dokken!
Metal would not be what it is today. Are they really about the best? Yeah. I mean, they're better. What other shows have you seen here?
But Metallica.
Metallica.
To the dawn.
How do you think people perceive you? The image you project. When they look at Ed, who do they see?
Probably a punk. You know, somebody who's bad, somebody who trips acid every day, you know, takes a lot of drugs. But I don't, you know.
How'd you get into hardcore?
Dan, or Damien, whatever, kind of exposed me to it.
Terror at your door, see no more. This is killing murder, it's further desire to set the fire. One life, take a life, give a life, kamikaze. Terror at your door, save no more. Since it's killing murder, since further desire to start the fire. One life, give a life, take a life, kamikaze, destroy. Girls and boys with great joy, send body bags. That's...
What's it mean?
Well, it means, you know, self-inflicting death, you know? Doing things, like that verse right there means, it means, you know, terrorists, you know? Killing other people.
Talk about the generation gap a little bit. How old are you?
21. 19. What can I say?
What do you guys think they're young or a little old to be here?
Look at these other two brothers, man. We've been coming up Priest every
younger
year.
Crowd now. It used to be an older crowd. This is the 6th time I've seen the Priest.
Oh yeah?
It's probably the first time, most of it, you know.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, let's see. It's just the words. It's power. Give the devil power. And it's nothing to do with God or anything like that. It was just praising the devil, giving him the glory. And I just don't care for that. It was all things that I didn't like. You know, the killing, the how they treated children and the blood and all that. I just didn't care for it.
Just jump around, bang my head, thrash, move around. If I feel like it, just fall down on the ground and spaz out. You know? Just whatever.
Alright, well, what's your name?
Graham, man, like grab a dirt and shit.
Yeah.
One last question I have for you. Do you think that he has a price to pay in terms of God and so on and so forth for this kind of music?
Oh, definitely. If you read the Bible, if you read the scriptures, definitely.
In what way?
Well, if you know, it says either you're for me or you're against me. That's what the Bible said. And if you're against me, he says, I'll spew you out of my mouth. And there's going to be a time when the Lord comes, and if Eddie's not ready, he's going to go to a place that he doesn't want to go. He's not serving God. He's far from serving God. He knows the Bible. Eddie does. And even though he may not be doing anything wrong, he's not doing what God wants him to do.
All I can say is that I'm not doing this I'm not saying, well, I'm going to do this, and I don't care about serving God and things like that. I'm just doing this to express myself, you know? Doing what I want.
Let's recap what's been covered in the first and second part of this documentary series before moving on. We've been focusing mainly on the music industry, and in part one, I did my best to prove the point that our modern entertainment industry exists almost for the sole purpose of social indoctrination and just to desensitize us, you know, from morality and from moral righteousness. And what's worse is that this agenda is deliberately targeted towards the youth. And we discussed the invention of celebrated people, you know, aka celebrities, and examined how these celebrated people all tend to promote the same movements and the same trends and social ideologies, and therein exposing themselves of being little more than musically proficient change agents, you know, rather than actual creative artists who are honestly expressing themselves. And then in part 2, I just lamented the reality that we are all part of a society that by and large worships these celebrated people, you know, and the music that they produce. But it's worse than simply promoting a liberal narrative, because the real underlying message and intended influence that's being pushed by these so-called artists is a deliberately satanic one. And part 2 breaks down the evidence to substantiate this fact by centering around the life and influence of infamous dark magician and professed Satanist Aleister Crowley. So I won't waste any more time rehashing what we've already been over, but if you've been following this series, then that's a refresher for you. And if you haven't seen part 1 and 2, then I hope that I've intrigued you enough to drop everything and watch them both immediately, or maybe after this video. But anyways, that brings us up to speed, and here we are, in a society that is largely hypnotized by the enchantments of this satanic propaganda that's disguised as entertainment, you know. Not even just entertainment, but inspiring entertainment, and entertainment that's meant to motivate and to change lives, you know, if you listen to Disney. Entertainment which is conducted by people who are oftentimes open and practicing witches and occultists who specialize in hoodwinking others. And I just feel like I'm stuck in this dystopian world where I'm surrounded by screens and speakers that are constantly broadcasting the same propaganda, you know. And it's not just your ordinary political propaganda, not just marketing propaganda, but it's this destructive and anti-human propaganda. You know, and I think if you look at this stuff carefully and honestly, it's clear to see which target that this propaganda is aimed against. You know, it's God as our creator and any semblance of traditional and moral righteousness. And even without the overt presence of blatant Satanism, you know, which does exist in the entertainment industry, but even without that, this agenda would still be rightfully described as satanic, simply based on its outcome, you know, and the effect that it has on society, which is, I think, irrefutably negative. I mean, how else would you describe a system that will openly hypnotize its subjects only to then bombard them with messages of self-destruction, you know? And it's successfully and effectively transforming this world around us into the prophesied beast system, in my opinion. And it's happening right before our eyes. I mean, just look outside. How many young people have covered their bodies now, you know, and faces with tattoos, often depicting demonic symbolism, no less? Children walking around dressed like androgynous prostitutes. I mean, I've seen sweet old ladies that are wearing clothing or accessories that bear the image of skulls and crossbones, you know, and everyone's just obsessed with this culture of death and destruction. You know, popular music, which was once brilliant and complex and beautiful, you know, and which once evoked inspiration in the masses, has largely been replaced by this dumbed down, hypnotic, and abrasive noise pollution that tends to revel in messages of sadness and anger. You know, alternatively, much of today's popular music is defined by its level of edginess or shock value. Rappers who boast of their violent crimes against others, you know, or lyrics that depict sex in pornographic detail. And then rock music, which has become practically synonymous with the imagery of death, you know, metal music, as much as I personally enjoy some of it, but you just can't deny how much metal music is obsessed with death. These album covers that you're seeing right now are just a small sample of some metal bands that are actually really popular and super famous. So if that says anything about the world that we're living in. These metal bands are an extreme example of this obsession with death, but really it is everywhere. I mean, the most popular shows on TV are true crime shows that detail events of murder and violence. And movies are no better, most commonly centered around themes of murder and violence, seduction and betrayal. You know, serial killers, that's the stuff that we like because we have this bloodlust, you know, and I'm guilty of it too. But let's not deny it. And how about video games? I mean, when I was playing Nintendo 64 25 years ago, even back then, games were all based around the concept that for some reason or another, your character needs to go around killing people, you know, because that's what's fun for us, I guess. It's a culture of death. I mean, you guys, even as I'm making this video, there are literally protesters raging in the city's streets outside, conducted by angry pro-choicers who are absolutely furious about the prospect that killing babies may soon be illegal in some states. You know, they view humans as disposable. And why shouldn't they? They're born into a world that teaches you that from childhood, you are this soulless animal, just taking up space and threatening nature by your mere existence. And so we're conditioned to disrespect ourselves. We're taught that we're overpopulating the planet and we're just ruining everything. We're like parasites against Mother Nature. And monkeys, that's what they say that we came from. We evolved from monkeys, and we call our children kids, just like the name of this documentary, but that's really a name for a young goat. And so we send our little young goats off to schools that corrupt their innocent minds with anti-scientific nonsense designed to sow seeds of confusion into their ever so trusting minds, confusion about their very identity, no less. And that was a generous way to word that, by the way. What I should have said is that we send our children off to indoctrination centers filled with perverted freaks who like to prey on the innocence of children, and all these kids are just talking about how many hookers they killed in Grand Theft Auto last night and whatever was on South Park, and they're listening to all this obscene music, which is marketed and targeted, to that particular age demographic. And everywhere they look, it's just a reinforcement of this same kind of satanic crap. And when it comes to what influences children in 2022, look no further than the very same trash that you see while you're surfing the internet or while you're flipping through YouTube or scanning through the radio. Because these days there's no barrier between what you see and what the kids see. This internet era has opened everything up, and it's all right there out in the open. And even the worst and most extreme pornographic material that you could imagine is now being viewed by millions of kids, in the same way that you and me may have peeked at our grandparents' Playboy or something like that back when we were kids. I mean, just think about that. I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm sad to confess that after years of exposure to porn and violent media, and this kind of stuff, it's haunted my imagination, And even as a Christian to this day, I just can't unsee so much of what I've placed before my eyes over the years. And that's why it breaks my heart to consider the effects that are being incurred on the youth of today by this trash. Because the stuff that we once regarded as pornographic is now just, mainstream and acceptable by the new public standard. That's the kind of stuff that just gets passed around as a funny meme, by kids that are playing on their smartphones while sitting in class. Which, could you even imagine that, by the way? I remember I used to play with my calculator and try to pretend it was a video game, but kids these days actually have access to the internet and the, smartphones while they're sitting in class. But that's neither here nor there. But anyways, these music videos today, they're just chock full of all this sex and satanic symbolism. And this standard of today of what's acceptable when it comes to this kind of stuff is what, again, we used to regard as pornographic. Half-naked women and men alike are twerking on these videos against provocative backdrops, and even the lyrics of these popular songs are describing and celebrating the indulgence in every sin that you could imagine. And that spans all of these different genres of music, modern music, all the way to pop music, all the way to what you hear on Kids Bop CDs. And while a sane and competent society might cringe at the popularity of such unsophisticated trends as this, a satanic society that has been incrementally debased over years and generations, like ours, actually cheers and invites this mess into our lives, and we applaud these clowns and we beg for their autographs. And all these so-called stars are then promoted to the youth as figures that are worthy of worship, and they roll them out onto the stages of events like the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards, where they're presented as acceptable role models, and they prance around in their designer clothes and their mini skirts, and they bask in the attention and praise that they receive from your children. But why shouldn't your children worship these people, and worship this system? Is this not the culture that we've modeled for them? Because when I was growing up, it was kind of a similar situation, at least in terms of the celebrity worship thing, with the rock stars always being on these elevated stages, towering above you, with lights shining at them while you just chant and cheer and just try to touch their clothes if you get close enough, just practically worshiping these rock stars. That existed when I was young. When I was really young, it was like Michael Jordan and Hulk Hogan, those were my idols. But then as I got a little bit older and became a teenager, I traded out my old idols and got new ones, which were usually punk rockers, and underground rappers and these kinds of people. And that was sort of the route that I went, music. But other friends of mine chose to adopt athletes and movie stars as their new idols. But either way, in the end, we were all transitioned seamlessly from adolescence into adulthood without the system losing one moment of our undivided attention. But nobody ever wants to be labeled as brainwashed, though, myself included. You know, we don't identify as sheeple or cattle, but we all act that way, you know, just inserting ourselves into these pre-formatted categories, you know, these secular categories and styles and subcultures that we can identify with, you know. I mean, it was most annoying in my music days because I was surrounded by all these other aspiring rock star types who were also concerned with their public image and their insistence of their own importance. And the big catchphrases were always self-expression and individuality. By associating with these bands, you know, and having the same piercings and tight pants and face tattoos, you know, it was supposedly all about self-expression. Because, of course, there's no better way to express yourself than to dress and sing and behave like everybody else in whatever clique it is that you desire the acceptance of. You know, and how could you possibly be more rebellious than to cover your arms in tattoos and get piercings all over the place just like every other rapper and rock star does? How original, you know, and I don't know, it's just cringy to me as an artist how stuff like this passes for original when in reality it's all just variations of the same thing, you know, because these modern genres of music have created actual subcultures. Like there's subcultures that are associated with a genre of music and we just accept that as a normal thing. Like, oh, that's a totally regular thing, and you know, but clearly it's about a lot more than just music, you know, it's about lifestyle. I mean, have you ever noticed how you can almost tell what type of music somebody listens to just based on the type of clothing that they wear? I mean, of course, there's exceptions to this, you know, and there's also a lot of people who enjoy a wide variety of music styles, but just as a rule of thumb, you know, the guy in a cowboy hat and his tucked-in flannel shirt is probably not the world's #1 Tupac fan, right? And the guy with the green mohawk and the nose ring that's got tattoos of demons up and down his arms is probably not into Dave Matthews Band. Everybody just happens to slightly resemble the celebrities that they like the most, you know. Every genre of music seems to be accompanied with its own dress style to accommodate it. And I think that the truth is that the people of this fallen world are really just lost, like the Bible says, you know, and while their preferences and tastes may certainly differ, what they're truly seeking is community. You know, they don't want to be alone. But it's really sad, you know, because these worldly styles are just man-made constructs. And in modern times, these secular styles end up kind of defining people's identity. You know, people do find communities within these so-called music genres, you know, but everything that comes along with a certain style. So it's like if you're into punk rock music, you're not just into punk rock music, you're probably also into skateboarding, and then by association, probably snowboarding, and you probably like old school hip hop too, because that's allowed by that standard, you know. Whereas if you're really into country music, you're probably also really into the Second Amendment, you know, and so on and so forth, you know. But it's just like politics and sports and competition, and it's just like everything else. People don't actually want to embrace their individuality. People want to fit in. You know, people certainly don't want to go against the grain. But I think the fact that these modern music styles have actually created these subcultures, and I shouldn't even say that they created them, you know, in reality, I suppose this was probably always part of the same agenda, as is everything else. But in the end, when you have subcultures, when you have actual, you know, cults practically, cultures of people associating themselves under the banner of, you know, this band or this style of music, and they all take on a certain stylized way of dressing and acting and behaving, it's just all really cult-like, you know. And it ranges from obvious to ridiculous. You know, whether it's a biker guy with his AC/DC shirt, you know, or deadheads in their tie-dye shirts and their patchouli-drenched bandanas. Or how about juggalos, you know, who are literally dressed like homicidal clowns? I mean, it's just crazy that it's this easy to control people, but that is the reality of what's going on. It's not a coincidence that when the Beatles were popular, all the teenage boys on the streets of, you know, every European country in America had haircuts just like the Beatles did. And the bizarre fashions and new styles that are donned by all these celebrities or celebrated people, you know, 2 years later become what you see everybody wearing down the sidewalks, you know, and that's how the influence works, and that's how the whole thing works. And it's just sad for me to accept that so many of these people around me in the fallen world are embracing these subcultures, you know, but not just embracing them, they attach their identity to these subcultures. That's the key word, identity. That word is the key to understanding the true nature of this war on kids. There is indeed a war on kids. And I can't imagine a sadder statement than the one that I'm about to say. But Satan himself is using the systems of this world to entrap, corrupt, and destroy your children from within. This term identity will soon be used to dismantle your family. As your child sets out on his or her journey into the real world, they will be met by zealous recruiters at every corner. Zealous recruiters of every variation of Satanism, every variation of secularism and humanism. They represent every possible combination of sin and foolishness out there. But each will offer one similar promise: inclusion in a community, acceptance, a greater sense of identity, popularity, within those communities. And identity, that's like the most important thing. The word itself means the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. The fact of being who or what a person or thing is. At least that's what it means according to the dictionary. But according to your child's third grade teacher, identity means whatever you perceive yourself to be, or whatever you temporarily perceive yourself to be in this moment. And whether it's coming from the LGBT movement or the entertainment industry or right out of the mouths of your kids' teachers, children are being pulled in every direction from all these different points of influence that are all targeting them directly and trying to persuade them into some weird allegiance to the New World Order, an allegiance to humanism. But it's really more than that. We need to understand that this battle over identity, actually this battle over the very word identity and the definition of it, it's really a battle for souls. But what does the Bible say about our identity? Off the top of my head, I know the Bible says that we're all born into sin, and that when we were of the world, we identified with the things of this world. But when we accept God's gift of salvation, we have a new identity in Christ. Check out some of these verses. So now that I feel like I've sufficiently lambasted the credibility of the music industry and exposed it for the control mechanism that it actually is, I feel like this is a solid foundation to build on. Because sadly, music is only one small aspect of this greater agenda. So moving forward, this documentary series is going to enter some pretty dark places as I attempt to prove my case that our children are under direct assault by the very same forces that most parents invite and applaud. Music was a great launching pad because music is like a bridge, as they say, the universal language. Everybody's affected by music. And I think that more so than any other influence, music has probably served as the main catalyst which has invited so many of these satanic and negative and evil trends into our everyday life that we're surrounded by now. But I'm sad to report that the worst is still yet to come. There is a social fracture coming. The sides have been polarized almost beyond repair or rectification. And I believe that soon this world that you see outside your living room window will look a lot different. And this event will be politicized, but make no mistake, this war is not political, and it is spiritual. Our children are on the front line of this war, and most of us are dancing around on the battlefield like idiots who don't even understand that there's a war going on.